The topic of spontaneous human combustion is a confounding phenomenon that baffles scientific researchers and local investigators just as much as it does ordinary people. Also known by the abbreviation SHC, it centers around instances of human bodies burning without an obvious ignition source, and it can reportedly happen to both living people and those who are recently deceased. Potential instances tend to happen in bizarre situations, and the available scientific evidence remains rare. Investigations into reported cases suggest explanations that may include alcohol consumption, victim actions, and proximity to ignition sources. Many scientists theorize that many cases overlook external ignition sources, but others believe unverified natural circumstances might be responsible. So let's take a look. Is spontaneous human combustion real? Written records of the first case of spontaneous human combustion date back to the 1600s, and a pattern of isolated cases developed in the following centuries. In most of them, the phenomenon happens in conditions that defy explanation. Someone finds a heavily burned body with relatively unscathed physical surroundings, except for greasy soot or residue on the ceiling and walls of indoor cases. One interesting twist is how the victim's extremities are usually intact. The person's feet and hands are often found unburned, while the head and torso are nearly entirely wrought by fire. Despite the consistency of these reports, they go against the grain of known fundamentals of heat transfer and fire behavior. This is one point of conflict between skeptics and believers of spontaneous human combustion. Paul Raleigh was a Fellow of the Royal Society. In 1746, he first proposed the terminology in a Philosophical Transactions article. He was writing about Countess Cornelia Zangaribondi, who died mysteriously. During the Italian noblewoman's final dinner, the 66-year-old countess was reported to appear heavy and dull by witnesses. Several people who knew her said she liked to drink brandy, and she sprinkled camphorated brandy on herself for pain relief. Her maid went into her bedroom before the two spent several hours praying and conversing. The maid left when the countess had fallen asleep. The countess had not risen by her usual time the next morning, so the maid returned to the bedroom to check on her. This is when the maid discovered the noblewoman's remains, and the bedchambers were full of soot. The actual body was now just a pile of ashes only a few feet from the bed, but several body parts remained. The front of the noblewoman's skull, 3 fingers, and her lower legs beneath the knee were still primarily intact. None of the furniture, including the bed, seemed to be impacted by the fire, save a smelly, greasy layer. A lamp without oil, but covered with ashes, was on the floor. The arrangement of the bed sheets suggested that the noblewoman had gotten up sometime during the night. Spontaneous human combustion is an idea with plenty of skeptics, and many of them argue that the reported cases are easily explained because potential ignition sources were overlooked, including embers or dropped cigarettes. It's also been suggested that the human body has a wick effect, where it acts like a candle that's inside out. In this theory, an external flame source that's small enough in size is able to ignite a victim's clothing, and a burning cigarette would sometimes be enough. Body fat would melt due to the heat, soak into the victim's clothing, and provide a prolonged fuel source. This would result in an extended burning period for the human body, even when the physical surroundings remain unchanged. In many reported cases of spontaneous human combustion, the victims were under the influence of illicit substances, or they were incapacitated somehow while being alone. Circumstances such as these would render them incapable of responding appropriately to a fire of an accidental nature. While spontaneous human combustion is equally fascinating and macabre, it might be the unfortunate consequence of ordinary situations instead of supernatural or paranormal activity. Still, even skeptics have noticed how reported instances of spontaneous human combustion seem to follow a certain set of common characteristics. These were documented in a 1938 British Medical Journal article where L.A. Parry referenced a book published over a century earlier, noticing how many cases included 6 commonalities. First, most of the victims were known to be chronic alcoholics. Second, the victims tended to be elderly females. Third, the body's combustion left a foul-smelling odor and residue of greasy ashes. Fourth, bodies didn't typically burn spontaneously, but had come into contact with an ignition source. Fifth, the feet and hands normally fall off. Sixth, the fires didn't do much damage to combustible items or surfaces that were in physical contact with the bodies. Alcoholism is mentioned a lot in early literary references about spontaneous human combustion. Victorian-era writers and physicians often believed that alcoholism was a cause of spontaneous human combustion. A fire is almost always a tragic event, and this is certainly the case when a life is lost. Fire can consume a property and someone else's whole life in just minutes, and it can all be over before first responders can even show up. Any fire should be investigated for cause, but sometimes there isn't an immediate answer. Some cases show the hallmarks of spontaneous human combustion. Can this even be real when science has yet to prove its existence? Several documented incidents look like cases of SHC, but no one can be sure so far. Perhaps no case of HSC is discussed more than that of Jeannie Saffin. The 1982 death of this 61-year-old woman is notable because she wasn't alone at the time that her body burst into flames, a notable departure from most cases where the victim died alone. Saffin came into the world with several serious disabilities, so she never left her parents' home. At the time of her inexplicable combustion, she was in the home's kitchen with her brother-in-law and father present. They weren't paying her much attention until they both saw something bright in their peripheral vision, and that happened to be Saffin on fire. They tried dousing her with water and summoned an ambulance. Saffin struggled for over a week before succumbing to her injuries. The official cause of death in the records was bronchopneumonia from her burns. During the inquest into her death, her two relatives maintained what they had seen. Her father reported flames that had shot out of her mouth, making roaring noises like a dragon. The family also reported that the clothing Saffin wore at the time was not touched by the fire, but later investigations disputed this claim. An official coroner told the inquest that spontaneous human combustion wasn't possible, and researchers later ventured the theory that a pilot light in the kitchen stove might have sparked the fire. Witness accounts indicated that the kitchen might have had open windows that would result in a cross breeze that might carry a flame to Saffin. Michael Faraday was 76 years old when he died in December of 2010. The County Galway, Ireland coroner listed his cause of death as spontaneous combustion in the official records. Dr. Kieran McCaughlin reported to an inquiry that the fire was investigated thoroughly and fit into the SHC category, despite the phenomenon not having a credible scientific explanation. He never recorded something like this in a quarter-century of investigating deaths. Forensic analysis ruled out any traces of accelerant, foul play, or the fireplace in the room being part of Faraday's combustion. Henry Thomas was 73 years old when he burned to death in South Wales in 1980. He was found in the living room of his home, and his whole body showed signs of incineration. The only things remaining were his legs under each knee and his skull. His lower limbs still had their trousers and socks, and half of the chair his remains were sitting in was still intact. Margaret Hogan was a widow who died alone in March 1970 at the age of 89. The resident of Dublin, Ireland, was discovered burned nearly entirely, but her feet and lower legs under her knees were still intact. Most of the physical surroundings near her body were also unscathed, but plastic flowers in the middle of the room had melted down to liquid. A television screen over 10 feet away was also melted. A neighbor had visited the previous day and remembered a small coal fire in a grate burning. A formal investigation just days later officially listed her cause of death as burning, but there was never any connection between her death and the great coal fire established. Official records listed an unknown cause of the fire. Mary Reeser was 67 years of age when she was discovered burned to death in her home. In July 1951, her landlady felt the doorknob to the house, only to find it was atypically warm. She contacted the police, who showed up and entered the home. In doing so, they discovered Reeser's remains burned almost entirely to ash, save one leg. The chair she had been sitting in was also gone. Reeser was known to smoke and use sleeping pills, which could have resulted in her losing consciousness and dropping a lit cigarette to ignite her gown and slowly killing her with fire. The chair was alone on a cement floor, so her daughter-in-law claimed that her physical fat kept the fire going. Even with some plausible explanations, spontaneous human combustion is a source of ongoing mystery. Several cases have proven hard to explain by wick effect or due to the lack of conventional ignition sources being present. Alternate explanations that have been ventured at one point or another include high concentrations of blood alcohol, accumulations of methane within the human body, and static electricity. Further compounding the mystery is that these theories don't have enough scientific evidence behind them. Research is ongoing, but there aren't any definitive conclusions so far. In 1984, a forensic analyst and science investigator conducted 2 years of extensive research into spontaneous human combustion. John F. Fisher and Joel Nickel presented their findings in a journal for the International Association of Arson Investigators after studying 30 historically purported cases of spontaneous human combustion across 3 centuries. They revealed that the burned cadavers were nearly always close to ignition sources, including fireplaces, candles, and lamps. These sources were often deliberately left out of account incidents, possibly to make the stories have a greater atmosphere of intrigue. Their investigations also indicated patterns of intoxication, incapacity, and careless behavior. In cases where bodily destruction wasn't that extensive, combustible fuels were present, including clothing, comforters, or blankets. Flooring, floor coverings, and furniture stuffing could have been additional fuel sources in cases with extensive destruction. University of Tennessee research in 2002 showed that when human tissue gets burned, the resulting flame heat is too minimal to spread the fire involved. Scientists generally believe that purported incidents of spontaneous human combustion usually have an external ignition source, and that SHC without one is highly unlikely. Critics of this phenomenon cite the statistical rarity of the event as an argument against it. With billions of people worldwide, they wonder why there aren't more cases of people supposedly bursting into flame regularly. Skeptics arguing against spontaneous human combustion also point out how many presumed victims have low mobility and poor health, often due to obesity and advanced age. They might die in their sleep or just not be able to move if they do catch fire. Someone could pass away from a natural cause, such as a heart attack, and then drop their lit cigarette to ignite the smoldering of their clothes. The wick effect could happen because fat cells in the torso could fuel a fire, and the surviving limbs might be explained by their lower concentration of fat cells. While the scientific community has yet to provide a definitive answer as to why spontaneous human combustion happens, individuals in the paranormal and pseudoscientific communities have stepped forth to venture their suggestions. John Abramson had suggested that ball lightning could be responsible, pointing out that circumstantial evidence aligns with the limited charring of limbs. Michael Harrison proposed that poltergeist activity inside the combusted human beings sparked the fires that consume them. Larry E. Arnold introduced the idea of pyrotron, subatomic particles that increase the internal flammability of human bodies. Certain instances of potential spontaneous human combustion confound scientists, but make believers more likely to conclude that the phenomenon is possible. Robert Francis Bailey was one such case when his body caught fire while he was by himself in an otherwise abandoned building in 1967. He was an alcoholic and likely trying to find relief from the cold weather outside when someone walking by noticed a bright light from inside. They called the fire department, which arrived within minutes to find Bailey alive. Firemen reported a slit along his stomach that had flames coming out of it. He died as they tried to put out the fire, and they had tried to pry his jaw off a stair post that he had been biting into. Nothing other than Bailey had been on fire, despite several very flammable substances in that room. A formal inquest suggested he dropped a cigarette on himself, but skeptics argue against the lit ember theory on several fronts. A dropped cigarette wouldn't be bright enough to be noticed from outside. There wasn't enough surrounding damage, and the flames had popped up too quickly for a cigarette to be the ignition source. George Mott was a retired fireman who hadn't returned several family phone calls in 1986. His son decided to check on him, only to find a pile of ashes with several pieces of bone similar to created remains, but most of the home was intact. A television had melted nearby, but the bodily remains were on bedding that hadn't ignited. An oxygen tank in the room and its face mask were still intact and operational, and the bedside table had a book of matches that weren't ignited either. Officials theorized that Mott had a lit cigarette, despite having quit smoking and using oxygen. Even if a cigarette had started ignition, a fire that didn't damage his bedding would have not nearly been hot enough to cremate him. The gaps in explanation and the discrepancy between circumstances and truth have resulted in a nearly cult-like following of this case to this day. The concept of spontaneous human combustion fascinates many people, but draws the ridicule of others. Whether you believe it or not, it's a constant reminder that humanity still has many things to learn and understand. Despite thousands of years of recorded history, medicine, and science focused on it, the human body remains a source of wonder and amazement. With more research and investigation, the endless quest for new knowledge might yield truth regarding spontaneous human combustion. What is true now is how this topic highlights awareness about how dangerous accidental fires can be, and why everyone should remain diligent about their surroundings.